welcome everyone. That's a session about Drupal security, especially about application security and vulnerability management. We are going to understand what are those quite long words like vulnerability, right? Welcome. I'd like to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Balazs, used to be called Captain Reject. That's a very long story. Basically, I was working at that time for the European Commission in Brussels. And if any of you or companies try to deliver something to the Commission, most probably I was the one who rejected it, QA guy. Nowadays, I work at Patent as a CTO and also still being part of the European Commission, working as an IT security analyst and also being the Drupal security correspondent at EC and also being quite active in the mentoring community in Drupal and also being a provisional member at the Drupal Security Team. So basically, it all means I don't have a private life. So like I do lots of things. Let's start with Bug's life. Do you remember the cartoon from the end of 90s when there was a small poor bug and tried to survive all the things in the forest, and he ended up somewhere in the desert and all bad things happened with him? Anyone remembers that cartoon? Okay, great. So like basically you killed half of my jokes. That's awesome. What we are talking about here, those are bugs. So whenever there is a vulnerability in an open source, especially in an open source project, people might think those are like bad things. They might point on people, you did that. You don't know how Drupal works. It's never about this. Those are security issues, but such as all other bugs that might be reported by your business, those are also just bugs. So what we are talking about here is security awareness, because it's very important to understand how people at a company or even at a large enterprise can be educated for being aware of security, even starting with code security, but also going through security gates at the airports, or if those are installed at your workplace, you have to follow the certain rules, right? Individual responsibilities, such as yours or such as mine being an IT security professional, for company security policies to enforce them and to propose further changes. Those are our actions. And obviously, from time to time, these activities are audited. Sometimes you know about it, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just get an email from a department somewhere way further than what you just imagine in a large enterprise for some phishing exercises. So basically you get an email where there is a link, for instance, that you should not click, because you should think twice before, or 3 times, or a million times before you click on anything on the internet, right? Somehow you have to realize those exercises are making sure you are enough aware. Sometimes percentage, like during an audit or an exercise, can be super high. Then what it means for departments who are running security awareness programs at work is they should put their more effort to make it understandable for the people. We don't click randomly on links, right? On the other hand, large enterprises need organizational structures. Otherwise, everything just goes into mess. Usually, these structures coming from top. So what we imagine, for instance, in Drupal, something starts from bottom, from a contribution day that we are doing tomorrow, or from just a nice discussion next to a beer. In organizational level, usually these needs start from top. Also creating policies, there has to be a team that delivers it, that measures it regularly. And obviously, there are vulnerabilities in the name of the company that has to be assessing. What it means is basically all the people who are on that level to run these programs, especially security awareness programs, have to invest usually quite heavily in security technologies, such as cards that you have to check when you enter a building. Those sometimes in the background log your time or log your activities, not for, having the big brother just watching at your backhead. No, it's mainly about making sure all the processes, all the policies are followed. But for us, being, for instance, in smaller organizations, there are a few tricks that we can do. Using different forms of media to reinforce the message, in this case with capital M, means if something happened in the wild, like a Drupal vulnerability got exploited, in a Drupal team, I would highly suggest to let them know. Share this information. Send it over. Even organize a 10 minutes break to understand what could have happened. Why is it so good on a Wednesday night, we updated all our servers, and next day, wild exploits got developed and discovered. Also, recent attacks that happens basically weekly. What affects your systems, let your colleagues know via news or just pull these information via monitoring systems to your employees. Let them know about everything that happens in the wild, because it might, in a day, affect your systems. And when we talk about bugs, there are basically 4 types of bugs in terms of security: authentication, authorization, confidentiality of data, for instance, data leaks, or integrity of data. We are going to talk about each of them in the next slide. But because I said a bug's life, imagine a random insect. All these bugs, all these insects, I don't know better words in English, sorry, are basically through 4 different stages. And we start with the eggs. When there is a new product that you start to develop, you have to keep in mind how it can be developed and designed as of first sprint or number 0 sprint to keep the security as high as possible. In the planning phase, though, we have to think always about budgeting, especially when we run an agency business. Budget is always an issue, but it's never an excuse to say we just have to develop something to make our clients happy and then blindly say whenever there is any security issues, we just developed, leave us alone. This is not the right case. Continuously, you have to educate your people. You have to keep it up. You have to know what are the latest trends. In a session this afternoon, I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities in Drupal. You will see, for instance, in 2013, when OWASP introduced their top 10, there were other most, highly critical issues than 2 years ago when they republished the top 10. There are new issues, there are issues that got a little bit less serious, or for instance, browser softwares already protect us way better than before, things like that. And always do these educative sessions iterative. We are in Scrum usually, right? We think about sprints, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, even longer if it's like a very long project. We have to always spend some time. Please set it up. 1-2% is enough, usually, to educate your colleagues, organize some sessions internally, to understand why something should be more secure, what are the vulnerabilities, how it can be better. There is Andrew van der Stok, who wrote a book back in time, like early 2000s, And he introduced that thinking evil way of imagination, way of thinking. What it says, basically, there are a few questions that you can answer during your designing phase, saying, what could be exploited if I am a bad guy, an attacker, and how I will be able to reach that point? And if you have those patterns, if you have those, paths, then protect those paths. Or if there are some, fields where user input can go, then protect those fields. Imagine the cases, you don't have to imagine all of them, but imagine at least a few. Later on, next iteration, more and even more, how those can be exploited. There are some principles that we have to talk about here. Security principles, I hope it's going to be okay, good. So those are the first 5 when I would say the most important is to understand basically the principles of it. Let me choose one which is one of my favorite. Establish secure defaults. What it means is there is a method or there is a class that has default values, you have to always think the most secure one. If I'm just giving you an example, if it's 0, is it 0 like a default value, or is it null, or is it a null pointer? Which one will make the system in the design phase the most secure? If it's the number 0, then handle all the things that goes later in exceptions if it's not the number 0, but it gets a null. Always think about all the possible defaults. Those are very low level usually. In the second part, I would also, put out one, which is the first. Don't trust services. Imagine there is a third party, XYZ, that you always pull, and you, in your composer file, just decide, okay, I'm just going to use the stable version. Not fixing the version number, but using different techniques. And then in that side, the third party will just upgrade something. A few months ago, it happened with Twig, basically breaking Drupal 8, right? I guess a few of you remember that. It was a massive one-day issue for hundreds of people to figure out what happens if we use automations. I'm not talking about against, but use automations. But if you always rely on third-party stuff, whatever services, don't rely on them that much. Never trust them. It's not about personal thing again. It's only about keeping your systems safe, up and running. Let's go to the second phase. It's a nice caterpillar. When we think about after designing, after understanding all the security awareness principles, we have to start the development. Basically, this part will cover all the iterations till the first release. What are the basic principles here? Okay, there is a sentence which I don't like to read because, you just see it. But the last one is very important. Management of configuration, especially in Drupal 8, and already in Drupal 7 in features, we have to put all the configurations that relate to one specific software product or web application to configuration files and manage them, basically version control them, in order to be able to always set back if something happens. But also the same for sessions, and errors or exceptions have to be handled in code. Do not rely on services that just say, okay, I'm going to throw something randomly to the screen or to a third-party output, like decoupled approach, and it's just going to be okay. Because in weird cases, if the exceptions are not handled properly, you might end up with information disclosure about your systems, and attackers will not have to invest that many times to understand you are relying on PHP 7.1. Whatever, which already has vulnerabilities, and you are not running the latest version, and they will target you. So always handle exceptions, always handle errors, not just hide them, resolve them, but at least in the first place, mitigate them. Here are a few security practices that we have to practice during the implementation. For instance, use always HTTPS for the domain entries. Where the traffic goes in, you have to have something that blocks that protocols, for instance, or that blocks attacks that might result denial of service. If you use WAF, Web Application Security Firewall, then you might end up saying, okay, I rely blindly on WAF services. Again, WAF is usually a third party. Do not trust. Basically, never trust. Do not allow for directory listing is also a nice example here, which says basically whatever application you design, you have to hide and have to use a different pattern for marking the path. Such as in Drupal 8, we have the great pathing system with routing from Symfony. But if you imagine WordPress has a different approach, Typo3 does. Even in Drupal 7, you might end up a different, basically always ending up a different folder structure than what is on the server. It's a best practice, basically. And I don't think I should spend that many time for the sanitize inputs. I mean, who doesn't want to sanitize? It's usually easy. Even though if we go a little bit further, what I would highlight here is, again, the very last one, password policy. Do you remember in the beginning I said there are policies in large organizational level for security awareness? This turns there. So if a password never expires, I would say it's a quite bad policy, right? For instance, in Drupal, we have the password policy contrib module available for Drupal 7, Drupal 8. Kind of like unstable in Drupal 8, but contribute on it. You always can set up different hardening on passwords to not allow repeating of different characters. You can, again, rely on third-party services saying this password already got found somewhere in the net. And there are many other policy-related steps for hardening passwords. Let's go even further, which are basically here the last steps during the implementation, such as verifying file upload functionalities. You don't want to end up allowing exe files, right? You don't want to necessarily allow CSS or JS files to be uploaded. You usually think CSS is something that cannot be exploited. It can. JS, yeah, just basically do not allow script. It's the same. If you allow JS, like JavaScript files to be uploaded on your server, you basically just do the same if you allow in a filter format the script tag. The same madness will happen. Again, come to my session. I'm going to show you something that might open your eyes, saying XSS is not that stupid issue. Let's go further to the, I can't say it, Chrysalis. Some English people, Chrysalis should be, right? Anyway, when we arrive to the first releases of the application, so we are making sure deployment happens, tests were not failing, hopefully, and we go to the next step, production. What are the security testing? It's very important to understand what is the difference between an audit and a review. Review usually gives you an overview. saying use different cookie policies, harden some password ones, understand why SFTP should be used over FTP, basically none of them. What are the key moments, right? In an audit, though, we usually don't even call it in the industry audit, but assessment. It basically can be a white or a black box, or a dynamic mix, basically. If we talk about assessment, usually there are tools such as for Java applications or .NET or all these fancy proprietary softwares which are run by either Fortify, which used to be an HP product, or Veracode. There are many companies present on cybersecurity field, mainly from the States, and they provide for a lot of money, by the way, licenses that you can use. The thing is, when you do an assessment, usually you end up with millions of false positives. The reason why we, for instance, me as an IT security analyst, basically just can exist is the way all those false positives should be sorted out. Because if you end up even doing an assessment on a Drupal 8, just Drupal 8 standard profile, you might end up like, I don't want to over-exaggerate, but like literally 10,000 of issues. Going through one by one, good luck, see you next year. But that's why you use tools such as Burp Suits, which is basically a crawler software that helps you follow different paths. In Drupal, unfortunately, we don't have one single company, one single product that can be used for either white, so static code analysis, or black box, which is a dynamic one. If you have some ideas, please, or want to work on it, or sprint on automatic updates tomorrow, just let me know. Audits are usually easy to read. We don't end up saying, for instance, confidential information in audits nor in assessments, because those documents don't want to raise further issues, saying here is a proof of concept how I was able to exploit something on the site, but pointing on issues differently, escalating it later, saying for this issue you should resolve it in a certain time, gradually. And then these results, these basically reports, will give an easy overview, an executive summary, usually to business owners, to understand why they should invest further. Also, deployment happens usually not in a secure fashion. If you imagine in Drupal, there are the install files, right? When we install the given component, module, theme, whatever library, there are things that has to happen. When you uninstall the something, there are other things happening, such as clearing up some caches, removing some configs, things like that. Never forget to execute these, because if you just remove a module from a Drupal site, please do not, then those things will not be executed and later will cause, for instance, performance issues. No one wants to end up there having like 200 modules just removed from one day to another and no one knows what happened there, right? Also, these sayings, that one and the very last one, are important to memorize, because what it says, do not expose any secrets once installed. Secrets and secret management is another topic, like passwords, how you are storing them, how we are reusing and hardening them to change. But also, if something is already installed, so we are in the deployment phase, we should not expose any information, how it got installed. Are we on an Apache or an Nginx server, right? You don't want to expose these information. That's why usually we suggest to remove the install script from an already deployed Drupal site, because it's just not going to be used again, right? But also there are other hardenings from Drupal core making not available that file based on htaccess, for instance. And the very last one, every configuration parameter must be findable. It's again secret management. How you store those data, those configuration parameters that you might need to reuse later. If you scale it further, the application grows, or basically there is a damage in the data center without RAID 2 or 3, and you have to, get it back from a backup. So deployment matters when you think about security again. Automate as much as you can, but also keep the secret in a secret place. And we are turning to the butterfly, the nicest part. Usually, most of the companies that work like agencies, they try to keep the same factory type of work, because that's what most of the devs like, to create new. To say, here is a React Native whatever front end, and we are so eager to create the first application of the company that uses decoupled Drupal, right, with React. And then you end up with deploying the application in the previous phase, and you go to the next project because it's just so great to create yet another Drupal application. And then a month later, another one, and another one. And who will maintain all of these? No one, right? So release management. It's a beautiful topic. When you first deploy your production application or production ready one, where do you do that? Do you do that first on production, FTP, right? Like 90s? No. You do it via Git or via something else like a CI tool. But you never end up firstly on production. That's why you have a development or deployment environment or acceptance or UAT or whatever, just to test all the things that happens during your development, ending up with a production ready application. Also, that code has to be securely delivered. I'm not talking about getting a few millions of pigeons who will securely deliver it over the sky. No, please. But using credentials for accessing Git. If you have a CI tool, then put that CI tool a dedicated line. It has to be, again, secure. All the steps that can be automated anyhow, even just a simple click somewhere. Please try at least, but then do automate. And the acceptance tests that we all talk about, the previous session was great, saying what they do regarding, for instance, visual regression. It's amazing. Whatever tests you have, please implement it and also integrate it in the pipeline. It's a topic that usually happens, security incident response usually happens in large organizations. What we can learn out of that, if we run a smaller business, let's say again agencies, what are the steps that has to be done when there is a real incident? Usually what I saw back in time, something happened with a server. Imagine 2014, Drupal 7 highly critical security update got developed and got exploited in the wild massively in about 4 or 5 hours. So the thing is, most of the people went crazy. What they did, they tried to update Drupal too late. That's not the first step. The first step should have been to separate that instance from the others. If you have a flat network where all the servers from a weird typography but connect to each other, then the attacker only has to go to one server, exploit that, get, in the worst case, root access, and he will be able to jump to the next one, and you will never catch him, because you will just focus on the first one. Until you don't separate the first server that is already compromised, you will never know where he went, and usually he will clean up the path, because attackers always wake up earlier than we do, not just because of time zones, but what we have to know is disclosures of the different incidents. So there are hidden ones that, for instance, happens in a closed code, which you just don't share back to the community because those are specific for your site or application. Or there are 0 days. Be proud because you do Drupal. In Drupal, never happened any 0 days. 0 days means attacks already are available, especially massive attacks, before the patch is present. The closest one was in 2014, and last year the follow-up of the February issue, the remote code execution. 2-3 hours. Those are not long periods. Of course, it doesn't happen in Drupal like every month, but still, if there is a public service announcement by Drupal Security Team, please pay attention, because those are also not often happening, but then delegate time to resolve, remediate, or at least mitigate the issues. Identification of different attacks happens usually via monitoring or corrective maintenance. That's why we always have to know what we are allowing to our third parties, what we rely on, how often we update our server infrastructure, or what we give away to our clients, what they can do. If you give too many options on a Drupal site to your client, like even the UID one, please do not, then he might cause issues. Again, come to my session. You even can win some Belgian chocolates, by the way, and we will learn what we should not do on a Drupal site. Also, vulnerability management is a topic that we have to understand how it goes, because the thing is, it's again an iterative step. So the cycle is detecting the issue, detecting a vulnerability, then reporting it, not to the wild, please, and then remediate it. How it happens in Drupal. You have a contrib module, you somehow identify, detect a vulnerability. What do you do next? You don't tell to your best mate, huh? No, do not do that. You go to security.drupal.org or directly to the project page on drupal.org of that specific contrib. I know you are usually not IT security professionals. Don't worry. There are people who will take care of it. The Drupal Security Team and all the members. Report as much information as you have in the so-called private queue. Because the next step over there will be triaging that issue, saying, trying to reproduce based on the information that you've given, and understanding what is the problem there. If that has been proved, there is a security issue, a bug in the component, then the members will invite the maintainer. So at that moment, there will be about 40 people, more or less, in the whole entire globe who knows about that issue. You who reported, great, thanks. The maintainer who has to resolve it, that's the remediation, and the team that is dedicated following a disclosure policy. No one else. Until it gets published. Whenever something gets published on Drupal.org as a security advisory, there are always patches or always advices, update this version, update those versions to these and that version. Except if there are no answer by the maintainers. If you are a maintainer and you are getting contacted, please be supportive and nice with the members, because they don't want to put you in jail just because you did a bug. All of us are human beings, right? We all do mistakes. The way how they act, sometimes you might not like, but avoiding making your contrib module unsupported is still better than talking to someone and just saying, okay, you are not right. Be supportive and nice. Sometimes, for instance, later this year, or who knows, maybe next year, there will be Drupal Steward, which is a program run by DA, Drupal Association, and its partners, which basically, for a certain amount of subscription fee or open source and non-governmental projects, NGOs, those will be for free or for a very limited price. But for enterprises, partners will offer Steward as a possible mitigation, because not always you are able to update your systems, right? Then mitigations such as blocking different paths on a WAF level or turning off different components might help you to avoid getting exploited or compromised. Risk assessment, how we understand that, is basically whenever you get a Drupal core update, you get those numbers like 21 out of 25. Have you ever checked those 6 categories that are given? I would always focus on the very first, what is the authentication level, saying the attacker has to be either a highly privileged user, such as an admin, or even an anonymous can exploit the issue. And also the E, which turns to exploit, saying, are there already something? Usually that only exploit category can change over the time. So for instance, there is a new update coming out next Wednesday saying exploit is unproven. Then it will be like a week later updated. You will not be noticed about it, but it will bring up the risk, and it might end up with having exploits in the wild. Also, I would highly suggest to check the OWASP guidelines. OWASP turns to Open Web Application Security Project, which helps you basically understand all the things that I'm talking about here, raising some awareness, and basically writing more secure code. In the end of the story, as I said, do not trust anyone. But still, sources can be trusted, such as the Drupal Security Team, such as monitoring services, that don't change anything in your system, but tell you or tell your team what should be changed. Rely on them. Understand what is an MVD or a CV. Usually we use CVs. Those are numbers. That's a big library where basically lots of vulnerabilities are reported. Those are just informations. They don't do anything, such as Drupal Steward will. But they inform you about there is an issue with MySQL 5.1. God knows, it's quite old. These vendors are committed to inform you, but to not mitigate or not remediate risk. Knowing them makes change. I'm finishing this session. I'd like to turn everyone's attention to a camp that happens, I know, quite soon in Cluj, Romania, which is not so far from here, let's say. At least it's in Europe. Between 10 and 14 June, we are all meeting, such as last year we did in Lisbon, but this year in Cluj, which is like second, third biggest city in Romania, somewhere in the Carpathians. It has an airport. You can get there, most probably for a quite high price, but at least The camp will be awesome and we will work together. And there is another conference a little bit later, in the end of October, just the weekend before DrupalCon Amsterdam happens, where you can meet beautiful Bulgarian ladies, such as her. It's called Secure Open Source Days. That's a conference which will be first time given to the public as a 2 days conference. It happened this year in May in the Netherlands as a 1 day, and last year in Germany also as a 1 day sort of trial thing. And we realized the need for educating people, devs and business people as well, for raising some awareness for security. For sessions and for sponsors, calls are open, so please visit secosday.eu. And I'm just finishing with the 4 steps: the eggs, the caterpillar, the whatever is the third, and the butterfly. Please try to keep up security and enjoy some lunch over there. Or if you have questions, please shoot me. Everyone is hungry. So do I. Thank you.